The Alpha King's pup spoke only one term for months. She was the first to hear the second. The score was tied with 4 minutes left on the clock, and the stadium felt like it was breathing. The crowd of 50,000 people had been holding the same air for 3/4 of the game, passing tension back and forth between them like something contagious. Every foot stomp, every shriek, every desperate scream bounced off the concrete walls and came back louder than before, until the sound was not just sound anymore, but a physical thing that pressed against the chest and made it harder to think. Damien Okafor felt none of it. He stood near the 50-yard line with his helmet in his hands and his eyes on the field, watching the opposing team's defense move into position. His offensive lineman, Calvin Duke, a man whose shoulders were as wide as most doorways, was beside him, rolling his neck back and forth, burning off the kind of nervous energy that turns good players into sloppy ones. 2 yards to Damien's left, the backup quarterback, a 22-year-old from Georgia named Luke Ashby, was rubbing his wristband the way he always did when fear was working inside him, and he was trying not to let it show on his face. These were good men. Damien had played beside them for 3 seasons, and he knew their bodies and their habits the way you know the rooms of a house you have lived in your whole life. He knew that Calvin ate 3 protein bars before every game and kept a 4th in his locker for after. He knew that Luke prayed before the coin toss, not loudly, not dramatically, just a few seconds of closed eyes and still lips. He knew that both of them, in moments like this one, with everything on the line and the clock showing less than 5 minutes, would look to him before they looked anywhere else. Not at him. To him, there was a difference, and Damien had understood it for a long time. Being looked at was nothing. Being looked to was something else entirely. It was weight. It was the particular heaviness of being the person other people leaned on when the ground felt uncertain. He had never asked for that weight. He had simply never put it down. His head coach, Dennis Holt, jogged over during the timeout. Dennis was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been athletic and had let the years add something solid to that frame, and he had a voice that could have reached the back row of a stadium without a microphone. But when things were at their most serious, Dennis got quieter, not louder, and right now his voice was barely above a normal speaking level. 34 counter, Dennis said. If there's safety cheats left, you switch the motion before the snap. You ready? Yes, Damien said. Dennis looked at him for exactly 1 second. The way Damien had answered, not just the word but the quality of it, the weight behind it, the absolute absence of doubt, was enough. Dennis nodded once and jogged back to the sideline. That was the whole conversation. 1 question, 1 answer, 1 nod. It was entirely sufficient. Damien put his helmet on. He buckled the chin strap. He looked at the sky for a moment. It was a clear November night, the kind that smelled like cold metal and city air. And then he looked at the field. His teammates lined up around him. The stadium noise rose again as the referee blew the whistle to resume play. Somewhere in the upper deck, a section of fans began a rhythmic chant that rolled down through the tiers like water finding a path. Damien took the snap. What happened in the next 8 seconds was the product of years. Every early morning when he had come to the facility before anyone else arrived. Every evening in the film room, long after the rest of the team had gone home. Every play he had memorized, until reading a defense was something his body did, before his mind completed the thought. He saw the safety shift, left at the last possible second. He changed the motion with 1 hand signal. The route opened exactly as it was supposed to open, exactly the way it had opened 11 times in practice, and twice before in games this season, and the ball was already in the air, before most people in the stadium understood what was happening. The wide receiver, a lean and fast man named Darian Fowl, caught the ball in the back right corner of the end zone, with both feet inches inside the white line. He turned to face the crowd and spread his arms wide, and the stadium became something that was no longer describable as noise. It was larger than that. It was a physical force. Calvin Duke lifted Damien off the ground from behind. The man weighed 293 pounds, and when he wrapped both arms around Damien and hauled him up, Damien's feet left the turf entirely. Luke Ashby was sprinting in circles near the sideline with his helmet held above his head, making sounds that were more animal than language. Dennis Holt stood at the edge of the field, with both fists pressed to his sternum, and his eyes closed for a moment that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, a gesture that looked very much like a man giving silent thanks to something he believed in, but never named publicly. Damien raised 1 fist into the air. 1 arm. Straight up, 3 seconds, then down. This was his celebration. It had been his celebration since his second season, and it had never changed. His teammates had made fun of it more times than he could count. Calvin Duke in particular had described it to a sports journalist with enormous enthusiasm, approximately 18 months ago, saying that Damien Okafor celebrated touchdowns the same way a person hailed a taxi. One hand up, expression unchanged, waiting for the universe to acknowledge the transaction. The journalist had laughed and printed the quote. The nickname Alpha King had been in circulation inside the team for years before that interview, used with the particular affection that exists between men who spend enough time together in high-pressure circumstances. But after the quote ran, it spread further. It found its way into sports commentary, into fan conversations, into headlines. Alpha King. Some people said it with admiration. Some said it with a mild edge, the way people respond to those who refuse to be shaken by things that shake everyone else. What none of those people saw was what happened when Damien Okafor came out of the players' exit that evening and walked into the parking lot and found his wife waiting for him. Renee Okafor was standing near the third lamppost in the eastern section of the lot, wearing his old university hoodie and a pair of dark jeans that sat a little loose at the waist, because she was 5.5 months pregnant and most of her regular wardrobe had stopped fitting 2 months ago. She had her hands tucked into the front pocket of the hoodie, and her weight was on her left foot, and her chin was up just slightly as she looked through the moving crowd of fans and stadium staff. She was searching for him with the patient, unhurried focus of a woman who was fully confident he would appear. He saw her before she saw him. He always slowed down for this moment, the moment just before she spotted him. There was something in the particular way she stood when she was waiting, the specific stillness of her, the quality of attention in her face, that he had never found words for and had never tried to, because some things were smaller and more private when you put language around them. She found him. She smiled. He had first seen Renee smile at a dinner party 3.5 years ago, at an event neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. She had been at the other end of a long table, laughing at something someone said, completely unself-conscious about the fullness of the sound, and Damien had turned his head at that laugh and not found a reason to turn it back. He had spent the remainder of the evening trying to make her laugh again. He had succeeded twice. They had exchanged numbers at the door. He had texted her the following morning, which was uncharacteristically quick for him, because he was a person who moved with great deliberateness in most things, and did not like acting before he was certain. She told him later that she had been sitting with her phone in her hand for 45 minutes trying to wait a respectable length of time, and had given up. He had loved that detail more than anything she had done on purpose to impress him. They married 14 months after that dinner party. The ceremony was small, held in a converted barn in the countryside outside the city, in late September when the trees were just beginning to turn. Renee's mother called it understated. Damien's mother, Claire, called it exactly right. Both of them were correct in their own way. Damien crossed the parking lot and pulled Renee gently against him, arms careful the way they had been for months, conscious of the slight new curve of her. She pressed her face into his shoulder and exhaled the long, slow breath of a person who has been holding something tight for hours and has finally found a safe place to let it go. "One hand," she said into his jacket. "What?" "Your celebration. Calvin sent me a slow-motion video of it during halftime. One hand, Damien." He pulled back just enough to look at her. "It communicates the necessary information." Her expression did the thing he loved, the combination of agreement and exasperation that lived in the particular set of her mouth and the slight raise of one eyebrow. She thought he was both right and impossible. She had thought this about him since approximately their third conversation. The smile was not all that was on her face, though. He saw that too. She reached into the kangaroo pocket of the hoodie and brought out her phone and held it toward him. He took it. He read the message once. The obstetrician's office had sent it during halftime. Dr. Caroline Price had reviewed the anatomy scan from Renee's appointment 2 weeks prior and had noted a finding she wanted to discuss further. She was not alarmed, the message said carefully, but she preferred to speak with them in person as soon as their schedules allowed. She had an opening the following morning at 8:30. Likely nothing, the message concluded. Damien handed the phone back. He was familiar enough with medical language to understand what those 2 words actually meant. Likely nothing was not a reassurance. It was a doctor's very precise way of saying, "The matter has not been classified yet, and I want to look again," before I tell you how to feel about it. It was better than an urgent call at midnight. It was not the same as nothing. Tomorrow, 8:30, he said. I already replied, she said. We're confirmed. He nodded. She looked at him. Are you scared? Yes, he said. He said it the same way he said everything that was true. Plainly, without trying to soften it or reshape it into something more comfortable. She nodded. He took her hand and held it as they walked through the parking lot, past the vendors folding up their carts, and the security guards in orange vests, past the families loading into cars, and the groups of celebrating fans already making noise about where they were going next. The whole city was in a state of simple, uncomplicated happiness about a football game. Nobody around them knew what they were holding on to alongside each other in the cold November air. Renee fell asleep in the passenger seat before they reached the highway, her head tilted against the window, and her breathing evened out into the long, rhythmic depth of real sleep. One hand rested open on her knee, fingers slightly curled. Damien turned the radio down until it was almost nothing. The sports commentators were replaying the game, enthusiastic about everything, and he had no interest in any of it right now. He drove. The highway unfolded ahead of him. The city lights receded behind. He thought about the doctor's office and the morning, and he ran through what he knew about anatomy scans and what could come up in them, and he kept his breathing steady, and he kept his hands relaxed on the wheel, because he had learned long ago that the body leads and the mind follows, and if he kept his body calm, his mind would stay manageable. The word that had been sitting with him for weeks surfaced again as he drove. It had come to him the evening after Renee showed him the positive test, and it had arrived without ceremony, the way the best things do. He had been in the garage alone, and he had said it quietly to no one in particular. Pup. My pup. He did not know why that word, and not another. He only knew it fit the same way a particular chair fits a particular room, not because it was perfect, but because it belonged there. He had not said it to Renee yet. The word still felt new and soft and private. He did not want to say it before he was sure it was real. He pulled into their driveway and sat in the dark for a moment after the engine stopped. The house was quiet. The oak trees on their street moved slightly in the wind. He looked at the front door and thought about what might be waiting for them on the other side of tomorrow morning, and he told himself, in the wordless interior way he told himself most things, that whatever it was, he would not be alone in it, and neither would she. He helped Renee inside. She moved through the dark house without turning on any lights, because she knew every inch of it. He locked the door and stood in the hallway for a moment after she disappeared into the bedroom. The house was still around him. The house held a future he could not see, and normally the unknown did not bother him, but tonight it sat differently. He went to bed. He lay in the dark beside Renee, who was already breathing slowly. He put one hand flat on the mattress between them. The ceiling was dark above him. Somewhere in the city, people were still celebrating a football game. He let the sound of his wife's breathing be the closest thing to quiet that the night would give him. He stayed awake for a long time. The fear was small, and he kept it small, and he let it be what it was without letting it grow. That was the only thing he knew how to do with fear. Not deny it, not feed it, just hold it still until morning gave him something to do. The following morning arrived the way important mornings always do, without particular ceremony, wrapped in the ordinary texture of alarm clocks and cold floors, and the smell of the coffee maker coming on. Renee was already awake when Damien opened his eyes. She was sitting up in bed with her knees drawn toward her, and her hands wrapped around a mug of herbal tea, the steam rising in a thin thread in the still air of the bedroom. She was looking at the window. The light outside was the pale gray of early winter mornings. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "A little," she said. He got up. He dressed without rushing. They moved through the house that morning, in the quiet synchrony of two people who know each other's routines well enough that they do not need to negotiate space. She ate 2 pieces of toast. He had oatmeal standing at the counter. They left the house at 7:55 because the drive to Dr. Price's clinic took about 20 minutes, and Damien had a firm habit of arriving at every appointment between 5 and 8 minutes early. Dr. Caroline Price was a woman in her late 40s, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of unhurried manner that inspires confidence in waiting rooms. She had been Renee's obstetrician since the first trimester. She knew them both by name, and she had the talent of speaking to worried people without making them feel their worry was excessive or naive. She pulled up the scan images on the screen beside her desk and explained what she had seen. There was a measurement in the anatomy scan that had landed at the outer edge of the normal range. It was not alarming, she said, but it was the kind of thing she preferred to address with a follow-up imaging appointment, rather than leave unrevisited. She had already contacted the specialist clinic. They could get Renee in within the week. She was very calm as she explained all of this. Damien sat in the chair with his elbows on his knees and asked 3 specific questions. Renee asked 2. Dr. Price answered all 5 with precision and patience, and at the end of the conversation she said what she had said in the message. She was not alarmed, but she wanted to be thorough. They left the clinic at 9:15. Damien drove. Renee sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the road ahead. After about 4 minutes of quiet, she said, "I want to believe her when she says not to worry." "So believe her," he said. "She's earned the right to be believed." Renee turned to look at him. "You really think it's going to be fine?" "I think whatever it is, we handle it," he said. "And I think if she was truly worried, her face would have said so. Her face said something different." Renee was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Your ability to read people is genuinely unsettling sometimes." He said nothing. She was not wrong. The follow-up imaging appointment took place 6 days later, in a specialist clinic on the north side of the city. They sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes, and then they sat in the scanning room, and then they sat in a consultation room while the results were reviewed. The specialist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Frances Holt, no relation to Dennis Holt, came in with the images and spent 8 minutes walking them through everything she had found. The original measurement had been retaken. It had moved back into the center of the normal range, likely a positional reading, she said, a common occurrence with this type of scan. Everything else looked healthy and exactly as expected. Renee pressed both hands over her face for a moment. Damien put his hand on her back. That was the moment the tension he had been holding for 6 days released, very quietly, and without drama, like the last slow exhale of a held breath. They went home and ordered food from the Italian place on their street that Renee had been craving for 3 weeks. They sat at the kitchen table and ate, and the conversation that night was easy and warm, in the way conversations become when something feared has not come to pass. The months that followed had a different quality. Renee bloomed in the particular way of women who are carrying a wanted child and have passed the first gauntlet of fear. She was tired in ways she had never been tired before, which she described as the kind of tired that reaches your actual skeleton. She was also, on more mornings than not, genuinely happy, in a way that was soft and internal and different from her ordinary happiness. Damien noticed. He paid attention to what she needed and provided it without making a project of doing so, because that was how he showed love, not with declarations, but with an uninterrupted pattern of small attentions. He started talking to the baby. He had not planned to. He knew some couples did this, spoke to the bump, sang to it, read to it, and he had assumed when he heard about this practice that it was something he would not feel moved to do. He was wrong. It began one evening in February when he was sitting on the edge of the bed while Renee slept, and he found himself leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the outline of her under the blanket, and he said something. He wasn't sure what he said. It was quiet, and not meant for anyone but the child. He stopped, a little surprised at himself. He waited to feel embarrassed. He did not feel embarrassed. He kept doing it. He was careful about it. He chose moments when he and the baby were effectively alone. Renee asleep, Renee in the shower, Renee on the phone with her sister. He told the baby small and random things. He described the view from the bedroom window in the early morning. He told the baby what it felt like to be on the field when the noise was loudest. He said the word pup in the dark and felt it land the same way it always had, solid and right. The night before the baby was due, which turned out not to be the night the baby arrived, because babies make these decisions independently, Renee said, "I've heard you, you know." He looked at her. "Talking to him," she said. "Or her, I've heard you. At night, sometimes, when I'm half asleep." She paused. "You sound different." "Different how?" he said. She thought about it, like someone who isn't afraid of the quiet. He sat with that for a moment. "What do you say?" she asked. "I can never quite make out the words." He shook his head. "Various things." She smiled and didn't push, which was one of the reasons this worked. She always seemed to know exactly how much space to give him. Ezra Damien Okafor arrived at 2:14 in the morning on a Thursday in late March, after 21 hours of labor that Renee handled with a focused ferocity that Damien had never seen in her before, and that he found quietly extraordinary. He stayed beside her through every hour of it. He held her hand when she needed it, and stood back when she needed that. He brought ice chips, and spoke to the nurses in the measured, clear tones of someone who has learned to communicate what he needs without agitation. He did not fall apart, because she needed him not to fall apart, and he had already decided that. Ezra came into the world loud. He announced himself the way certain people announce themselves, without apology, without warm-up, with an immediate and complete assertion of presence. The sound filled the room. Renee laughed a short, exhausted, joyful sound, and the nurse said, "There he is," and Damien stood very still for one long moment, because something was happening inside his chest that he did not have a name for, and was not prepared to examine in a room full of other people. He went to the hallway. He stood with his back against the corridor wall, and he pressed both hands flat against the painted surface behind him, and he let it happen. Not loudly, not publicly. 2 nurses passed him in the hallway, and did not stop, because the look on a man's face outside a delivery room at 2 in the morning is one that needs no interpretation. He cried in the hallway for approximately 4 minutes. Then he wiped his face, squared his shoulders, and went back in. Renee was holding Ezra when he came through the door. She looked up, and she saw his eyes, which were still carrying what had just happened, and she said nothing about it, only looked at him, in that way of hers that said, "I know, and I'm glad, and you don't need to explain." He crossed the room and looked at his son for the first time. Ezra Damien Okafor was 7 pounds and 4 ounces of perfect new human life. He had a full head of dark hair, and his father's nose, and his mother's mouth, and his hands were so small that Damien felt something physically painful move through him at the sight of them. The nurses asked if he wanted to hold the baby. He sat in the chair beside Renee's bed, and they placed Ezra in his arms, and Damien held him with the careful, controlled strength of a man who is aware that some things in this world must be held as if they are the most important things in it, because they are. He looked at his son's face. "Hey, pup," he said, quietly, not for the room. The first weeks at home were a blur of the kind that only new parents experience, a sustained, slightly delirious mixture of sleep deprivation and love so large it had no edges. Renee was nursing, which meant she was awake in the night, and Damien was awake in the night with her, because he had decided that he would take the adjacent tasks, the nappy changes before and after, the burping, the pacing when Ezra was unsettled and needed motion, so that she could sleep in whatever windows existed. He was tired in a way he had never been tired in his life, and it made almost no difference to how he felt about any of it. He loved the night feedings. That surprised him. He had expected to endure them. Instead, he found himself in the particular quiet of 2 in the morning, with a tiny person against his chest, and something in the combination of the dark house, and the small weight, and the specific smell of a newborn, made him want to talk. Not to anyone, to the pup. He told Ezra things in the dark that he had never told anyone in the light. Small things and large things, without any particular order. He talked about football and about the city and about the oak trees on their street. He talked about the way Renee had laughed at that dinner party, and how he had known, in the way that a person sometimes simply knows, that her laugh was something he would want for the rest of his life. He talked about the apartment he had grown up in a crowded and noisy part of a city that was nothing like the quiet suburb where they lived now. He talked about the first time he had held a football and understood that his arm and that ball were made for each other. He never talked about his father. He was not ready for that yet. Ezra listened to all of it with the focused non-comprehension of a newborn, which looked, in the dark, surprisingly like genuine attention. His dark eyes would rest on Damien's face, and his tiny fists would be tucked under his chin, and the whole small person of him was so completely present that Damien sometimes forgot mid-sentence that he was talking to someone who had been on Earth for 9 days. The months rolled forward the way months do in the first year, faster than expected, full of landmarks that felt simultaneously enormous and ordinary. Ezra, at 2 months, smiling for the first time. A real smile, not the reflexive quirk of newborns but a deliberate reaching smile that crinkled his eyes and made Renee say, "Oh," very quietly, like she had just seen something she had been told about, but had not fully believed. Ezra, at 4 months, rolling, batting at the mobile above his playmat, with concentrated effort. Ezra at 6 months, sitting supported, exploring the world with his hands and his mouth, and the full force of his considerable curiosity. At 8 months, he pulled himself to standing for the first time using the coffee table. Damien was the one who saw it. He was sitting on the floor nearby, having been informed by every resource available that babies need floor time with a parent, and he had been doing this, sitting on the floor, watching Ezra, learning by watching. When Ezra grabbed the edge of the coffee table and pushed himself upright and stood there, wobbling, with an expression of such complete astonishment at himself, that Damien felt a laugh move through him that started somewhere very deep, and came out warm and genuine. "Good work, pup," he said. Ezra looked at him and grinned. It occurred to Damien, in a thought that was brief and not yet worrying, that a baby Ezra's age was supposed to be making sounds by now. Not words, not yet, but babbling, the preparatory music of language. The book said so. The pediatrician, a cheerful man named Dr. Warren Cole, had mentioned it at the 6-month visit. Consonant sounds, he had said. Ba, da, ma, that kind of thing. Ezra made sounds. He was not a quiet baby. He squeaked and shrieked and made long vowel sounds that rang through the house. But the consonant sounds had not quite arrived yet, and when Damien noticed this, which was on the same afternoon Ezra first stood at the coffee table, he filed it in the back of his mind, the way he filed things he was watching, but not yet ready to react to. Likely nothing, he told himself. He did not recognize the phrase as the same one the doctor had used months ago. He would recognize it later, when things were different. The playgroup met on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, in the community center, 3 streets from their house, in a carpeted room, with bright plastic chairs, and a collection of shared toys, that were cleaned and sorted every session, by a rotating group of dedicated parents. Renee had started going at Ezra's 8-month mark, because the health visitor had recommended it, and because she was, by her own admission, beginning to go slightly out of her mind from the well-intentioned isolation of new motherhood. She liked the group. The other parents were a mixed and interesting collection of people, and the conversations ranged from the logistical to the surprising, and on the best days, someone brought baked goods, and the children fell asleep simultaneously, and the adults talked like adults for 20 beautiful minutes. Ezra liked it too, in the way babies like anywhere with colors and other small humans to observe. What Renee did not like, what began to grow, slowly, like a change in the light before a storm, was the comparison. Not deliberate comparison, the comparison that simply existed in the space between one child and another when they were placed in the same room. By Ezra's 14th month, 3 of the other children in the playgroup had clear words. The children of a cheerful red-haired woman named Bridget could say mama, dada, cup, and no, with confidence and some frequency. A serious and careful boy named Toby, the son of a quiet man named Peter, had added up and dog to his repertoire. A girl named Clara, whose mother, Georgia, was a chatty and energetic woman who seemed to run on approximately 4 hours of sleep and enormous amounts of strong tea, could say something that very clearly approximated more, and something else that seemed to be her version of the family dog's name. Ezra watched all of these children with his wide, dark, intelligent eyes. He did not say any words. He communicated constantly. Renee was very clear about this when she described it to herself and, later, to others. Ezra was not a child who withdrew or went blank or sat without expression. He pointed at things with enormous conviction. He pulled her hand toward whatever he wanted to investigate. He had a sound that meant he was content, and a sound that meant he was frustrated, and a sound that was unmistakably distress, and they had learned to read these with reasonable accuracy. He looked at people directly when they spoke to him. He tracked movement and responded to his name and followed simple instructions. He simply had no words. At the 16-month check with Dr. Warren Cole, Renee mentioned this. She mentioned it calmly, factually, the way she approached most things she was secretly not calm about at all. She said that Ezra was not yet using any spoken words and asked whether they should be thinking about a speech therapy referral. Dr. Cole looked at Ezra for a moment, watching him as he explored a toy on the examination table. He asked a few questions about Ezra's understanding. Could he follow commands? Did he respond to his name? Did he point to things he wanted? Renee answered yes to all of them. Dr. Cole made a note and said that some children were late to spoken language but caught up quickly, and that they should keep watching, But he was not worried at this stage. He would revisit it at 18 months. Renee drove home from that appointment with the radio off. That was the beginning of the particular kind of awareness that parents know, the one that arrives quietly, without announcement, and then does not leave. She became more conscious of Ezra's silence in the days after that appointment, not in a way she allowed herself to dwell on, but in the way that once you notice something, you cannot unnotice it. She heard it in the moments when other children's voices rang out on the street outside their house. She felt it at the playgroup, more and more, as the gap between Ezra and the other children, in terms of spoken language, became less ambiguous and more consistent. She did not say any of this to Damien. Damien, for his part, noticed without saying he noticed. This was something they had in common, and it was one of the things that made them very compatible and, in certain moments, very difficult to reach. Ezra turned 17 months on a rainy Sunday. Renee made a small carrot cake because cake was Ezra's particular joy. The look on his face when he encountered something sweet was so complete and so theatrical that it had become a source of ongoing delight in their house. Damien came home from a short road trip that afternoon to find the cake half-eaten and Ezra asleep in the high chair with carrot icing on his cheek, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scene with the particular look he had when things were almost too good to sit comfortably inside him. He sat with Ezra at the kitchen table that evening, while Renee was upstairs. He had a habit of putting Ezra on the table in front of him, carefully, securely, with both hands ready, and talking to him face to face, the way he had always talked to him, as if Ezra was a full person, and the conversation was a two-way street, even when it was not. Tonight he held up a soft toy, a small brown rabbit that Ezra had decided was his closest companion, and he said, "What's this?" Ezra looked at the rabbit. He reached for it. He made a sound that was not quite a word. Damien said, "Rabbit." "Can you say rabbit?" Ezra's eyes went to Damien's mouth. He watched it. He watched it very carefully, the way he watched things he was trying to understand. Then he made another sound, still not a word, but the watching was real. The attention was real. "Rabbit," Damien said again, slowly. Ezra blinked. Damien gave him the rabbit. Ezra held it against his chest and rested his cheek on its head and looked at his father with eyes that held everything except language. Damien put his hand on top of Ezra's head and held it there gently. He did not say anything else for a while. The playgroup met that Thursday, and Renee put Ezra on the floor with the communal toys and sat in the circle of plastic chairs with the other parents and drank a cup of tea. The conversation moved, as it often did, through sleep schedules and feeding preferences, and the particular comedy of trying to keep a small person from eating things they found on the ground. And then Clara's mother, Georgia, said brightly, Clara said her first sentence this week. Well, almost a sentence. She said, "More juice, please," but the please came out as peas. We're counting it. The circle laughed. The laughter was warm and genuine. Renee laughed too. She reached for her cup of tea and brought it to her lips and laughed along with the rest of them. And across the room, Ezra was sitting with a plastic block in both hands, examining it with the focused intensity of a person solving a very interesting problem, and he was absolutely silent. Renee drank her tea. She did not let her smile drop until she was in the car. The 18th month appointment with Dr. Cole was the one that shifted things. Cole watched Ezra, examined him, spoke to him, and made several notes. Then he put down his pen and spoke directly. He said that Ezra's understanding was clearly strong. His comprehension of language was tracking normally, which was a meaningful indicator. But his expressive language, meaning the words he produced himself, was behind the expected range for his age. He recommended a referral to a speech and language therapist. He was careful not to use alarming language. He said it was the right next step and that many children benefited enormously from early intervention. He also said something else, casually, almost as an aside, that lodged itself in Renee's mind and stayed there. Sometimes, he said, the children who are the most observant, the ones taking in the most information, are the ones who take a little longer to start sending it back out. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. It just means the internal work comes first. Renee wrote that down in her phone on the way to the car. Ezra was in his car seat, holding his rabbit, watching the world go by through the window with his usual attentiveness. She looked at him in the rearview mirror. "We're going to figure this out," she told him. He looked back at her in the mirror. He said nothing. That evening, after Ezra was in bed, she sat at the kitchen table and made the referral call to the speech and language therapy service, giving the details Dr. Cole had provided and requesting the earliest possible appointment. The woman on the phone was kind and professional and said they would be in touch within 2 weeks. Renee thanked her and ended the call and sat for a moment with her phone face down on the table. Damien came in from the back garden, where he had been on the phone with Dennis Holt about scheduling. He saw her face and stopped. "I made the referral," she said. He sat down across from her. "Dr. Cole says his comprehension is normal," she said. "It's just the output, the words coming out." Damien nodded. "That's a good thing," she said. "That he understands. That's a good sign." "Yes," he said. They were quiet for a moment. And then, 4 days after that appointment, on a Wednesday morning in early autumn, while Renee was loading the dishwasher, and Damien was in the garden, and Ezra was in the living room with his rabbit and a board book he could not yet read, but loved to carry from room to room, Ezra stood up from the floor, walked to the doorway of the kitchen, and looked directly at his father through the garden window. Damien turned from the garden and saw him there. Ezra raised one hand. "Da," he said. One syllable. Clear. Intentional. Damien came inside immediately. He crouched down to Ezra's level. "Hey," he said. "Hey, pup." Ezra looked at him. "Da," he said again. And the single syllable, in the context of all the months of silence before it, was as loud as any stadium Damien had ever played in. The word did not stay still. That was the thing about Da. It was one sound, but in Ezra's hands, or rather, in Ezra's mouth and intent and the full force of his communication, it became more than one thing, almost immediately. Within days of its arrival, it was clear that Da was not a name. It was not simply a pointing at Damien word. It was the whole of language packed into 2 letters, deployed with a precision that would have been remarkable in a word 3 times as complex. Ezra pointed at his rabbit and said, "Da." He wanted Renee to hand him the rabbit. He pointed at the window and said, "Da," and turned to look at her, and she opened the window, and he leaned forward to feel the air, and he was satisfied. He reached toward the cabinet where his cups were kept and said, "Da," and she gave him his cup, and he took it without drama. He fell in the garden and sat for a moment in the surprised way toddlers sit after a fall, and then he looked up at his father across the lawn and said, "Da," and the sound was different, the pitch of it lower, the exhale in it longer, and Damien crossed the garden and scooped him up without being asked twice. Renee began to notice the variations. She had always been a person who listened carefully. It was something her mother had said about her when she was a child. Renee doesn't miss much. In her professional life before maternity leave, she had worked in project coordination, which was largely a job about listening to what people were not quite saying and understanding what they actually needed. That skill transferred to parenting in ways she had not anticipated. It transferred most usefully now. She noticed that "Da," with a rising pitch at the end, was a question. "Da" repeated quickly 2 or 3 times meant something was urgent. "Da" delivered once, low and slow, like something heavy being set down, meant he was tired or overwhelmed and needed stillness. A bright, short "Da" with a full body turned toward her meant he had found or discovered something and wanted to share it. She started writing the variations down. She had a notebook. She had bought it at a pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon when she could not entirely articulate why she was buying it, and she began filling its pages with what amounted to a translation guide, not in technical language, just her own descriptions, in her own words, in blue pen, which she had chosen over the other colors in the pen cup without conscious reason. The speech and language therapy appointment came 3 weeks after the referral. The therapist's name was Lucy Harmon. She was a woman in her early 40s, brown-haired, with the particular manner of someone who has spent many years listening to children and therefore listens to adults the same way, fully, unhurriedly, without the impulse to fill every silence that had not yet found its end. Renee liked her immediately. At the playgroup, the comparison had continued to accumulate in the quiet way that things accumulate when you cannot stop them and cannot address them. By the time Ezra was approaching 19 months, the other children in the group had between 8 and 20 words each. The words were not sophisticated. They were cups and dogs and no and mine and the names of preferred foods, and the names of caregivers, but they were words. They existed in the mouths of children who were Ezra's age or younger, and they did not exist in Ezra's mouth, except for the one. There was a morning at the playgroup. Ezra was 19 months and 2 weeks old, and the morning was a bright October one that smelled of autumn outside the community center windows, when Bridget, the cheerful red-haired mother, said something that she did not mean as anything other than friendly observation. She was watching Ezra, who was stacking rings with enormous concentration, and she said, "He's so focused, isn't he? My two were always so chatty at this age. Non-stop. Drove me mad, actually." She laughed. "You must enjoy the quiet." She meant it kindly. She meant it as a compliment to Ezra's focus, and a mild, self-deprecating comment about her own experience. Renee smiled. "He keeps us on our toes," she said. Which was entirely true, and told exactly nothing. After the playgroup, she buckled Ezra into his car seat, and put his rabbit in his hands, and got in the driver's seat, and put both hands on the steering wheel, and sat there for a moment, before she started the engine. The car park was nearly empty. A woman was loading a pram into a boot 2 spaces away. The sky was very blue, and very autumn. Renee started the car. She drove home. She did not allow herself to sit in the feeling for long, because she had learned very quickly that sitting in the feeling, without an action at the end of it, was not useful. So she drove home, and she put Ezra down for his nap, and she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and her blue pen, and she wrote down every variation of "da" she had observed in the past 4 days, because writing it down made it into something she was doing, rather than something that was happening to her. That was the way she handled it. That was always the way she handled things. She did not know yet that the notebook was going to become the most important document of this particular chapter of their lives. She did not know yet that Damien was going to read every word of it. She did not know yet what he would write in the margin of the last filled page. She just wrote. And across the house, in his room, Ezra slept with his rabbit tucked under his chin, and his small chest rose and fell, and his dreams, whatever they were his alone. There were things Renee kept inside herself that she did not share with anyone. This had always been true of her, but motherhood had added new chambers to the internal architecture where things were stored, new rooms that nobody else had keys to, rooms she visited alone, and usually at night, when the house was quiet, and she had enough space to look at what was inside them honestly. The most persistent thing in those rooms was not fear exactly. It was something adjacent to fear, something quieter and more personal. It was the feeling of being insufficient. She had read everything. She had read developmental literature and parenting forums, and the published research on late-talking children and early speech intervention outcomes. She had researched speech and language development the way she had once researched project timelines, systematically, thoroughly, with colored tabs and organized notes. She had attended every session with Lucy Harmon. She had practiced the exercises with Ezra in front of the bathroom mirror every morning, the two of them side by side in the glass, she making the shapes with her mouth that Lucy had demonstrated, Ezra watching her with the careful concentration that was his default setting. She was doing everything. She knew she was doing everything. And still, every evening at 6:15, when Damien came through the front door, she heard it. Da, da, da. Ezra would be wherever he was, on the floor, in the living room, at the table in the kitchen, and he would hear the key in the lock, and something in him would come alive, the way something comes alive in all of us, when the person we are waiting for arrives. He would move toward the door. He would lift both arms. His face would become a different thing entirely, open and bright, and full of the particular joy that did not need language, because it was too large for language anyway. Da, da, da. And Damien would come in and scoop him up and hold him with that careful strength of his, and Ezra would press his face into his father's neck, and the word would come one more time, softer now, more like a landing than a greeting. Da. Renee watched this every evening. Every evening she was glad of it. She was genuinely glad. She loved that her son had this with his father. She loved the completeness of their greeting, the absolute lack of anything withheld in it. And she would turn to the kitchen sink. She would turn her back on the doorway scene and put her hands on the edge of the sink and breathe. Just breathe. 1 breath, 2, and then she would resume whatever she had been doing. She had told no one about this habit. Not Damien, not her sister Pamela, who visited every few weeks from the city, and meant well, and consistently said things that made Renee feel both cared for and deeply misunderstood. Pam had come in October and had spent an afternoon with Ezra and had declared him wonderful, which he was, and then had said over dinner that her colleague's son had been a late talker and had just turned 5 and was perfectly normal now, as if the path between those 2 points had been comfortable and uneventful and not worth examining. Renee had said, "That's really good to hear," and refilled her water glass. Pam had also said, trying to be helpful, "Maybe it's because you and Damien are so quiet. He doesn't have a lot of noise to copy." Renee had nodded. Later, alone in the bathroom, she had looked at her own face in the mirror for a long moment and said nothing. The distance that was growing between her and Damien was not made of conflict. That would have been easier in some ways. Conflict has edges, it has words, it has a shape you can reach for. This was made of something vaguer and harder to address. It was made of all the things they were each holding separately and not handing to each other. He noticed when she was not okay. She could feel him noticing. He was enormously present in the practical sense. He showed up, he helped, he did the bath, he did the bedtimes, he drove to the therapy appointments when his schedule allowed. He was there. But the particular reaching across that couples do, the verbal reaching, the "I'm scared, and I'm tired, and I don't know what I'm supposed to be feeling," that had thinned between them. She thought he was keeping things behind that particular wall of his because he believed it protected her. He thought, she suspected, that staying composed was the same as being supportive. She did not know how to say, "I need you to be a little less composed sometimes." She did not know how to say, "I need you to crack, just slightly, so that I know the weight is distributed between us and not resting entirely on my side." She wrote some version of this in the notebook one night, not those exact words, just the feeling of it, in her imprecise and honest way, across 2 pages of blue ink. The notebook had become something she wrote in every few days. It had started as a record of Ezra's communication patterns, the variations of "da," the gestures, the sounds that were not yet words but were clearly meaningful, and it had expanded into something more than that. It had become a record of this particular chapter of their lives, written from inside it, with all the uncertainty and all the love that being inside something does not allow you to see clearly. She did not try to write it clearly. She wrote it the way she thought it, which was not always linear and was not always fair, and which was more accurate for both of those reasons. There was a night in November when Damien came home from a late practice and found her at the kitchen table with the notebook open. She looked up when he came in. He looked at the notebook and then at her, and she said, "Just writing some things down," and he nodded and went to get a glass of water. He stood at the sink, drinking it with his back to her. She watched his back. He was tired. She could see it, in the set of his shoulders, the particular way the tension sat there. She wanted to say something. She sorted through several things she could say, and found that none of them felt right yet. He turned around, and their eyes met across the kitchen, and something moved between them in the silence that was not entirely comfortable, but was not entirely disconnected either. It was still something. It was still them looking at each other. "You should sleep," he said. "In a bit," she said. He put his glass in the sink and came to the table and put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, warmly, and then went to bed. She sat for a while after he left. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "I am losing something and I cannot name what it is, but I don't think it's him. I think it's the version of us that didn't know how to be afraid yet." She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She lay beside him in the dark, and he was already asleep, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about the version of them that had stood in a parking lot on a cold November night, holding on to something unknown, and had been able to say it to each other without needing the words to be perfect. She fell asleep with her hand between them, close to his but not touching. In his crib across the hall, Ezra slept with his rabbit and his silence, and whatever particular inner life was building itself behind his wide and knowing eyes. Damien sat on the floor of the nursery at 1:47 in the morning, with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up and his hands folded between them. This was not unusual. He had been doing this for months. He sat on the floor of the nursery the way other people sat in churches or stood at windows, for the particular quality of what you find when you are still enough. Ezra was asleep in his crib 3 feet away. His breathing was audible in the quiet room. The soft rhythm of it was something Damien had come to know better than almost any sound in his life. He came here on the nights the weight was largest. Damien Okafor was a man who had built a considerable portion of his life around the appearance of containment. He knew this about himself. He had not always known it with such clarity, but the therapy sessions with Dr. Owen Miles, which he had begun in October, quietly, without telling Renee or anyone else, had illuminated it in the way that only a very good listener's specific questions can illuminate something you have been carrying for so long it feels like part of your skeleton. He had started seeing Owen Miles on a recommendation from his teammate Colin Marsh, the one person on the team he would describe as a genuine friend. Colin was a wide receiver, a fast and good-humored man from Newcastle who had been playing with the club for 6 years and who had developed the useful quality, for Damien, of never making a conversation into more than it needed to be, which made it possible, in the parking lot after an October practice session, for Colin to say, "You're not yourself, mate," in a very simple tone, and for Damien to stop walking and say, "No," and for that to be the start of something. He told Colin some of it, in that parking lot. Not all of it. He told Colin about Ezra's speech delay. He told Colin that he was worried. He said the word worried, plainly, in a tone that surprised them both, because it was a word that cost him more than most words cost him. Colin had listened. Then he had said, "My wife saw someone, a therapist, when we went through the miscarriage. Did us a world of good," she said, "for her. But also for me, watching her go, because she came home from those appointments lighter, like something was being sorted, instead of just held." Damien had thought about that for 3 days. Then he had made the call. Dr. Owen Miles had an office near the university, a room that was deliberately ordinary. Bookshelves, 2 chairs of the same height facing each other, a single plant on the windowsill that appeared to be thriving. He was a man in his late 50s with a measured, unrushed quality to his attention that reminded Damien of certain coaches he had admired, the kind who listened before they spoke, and spoke only what they meant. Damien had sat across from Owen Miles in the second session and told him about Ezra, about the silence, about the way Ezra used the one word for everything, and how he used it like a master, with a precision that was remarkable. But it was still one word, and there were supposed to be more by now. And the absence of more words sat in Damien's chest like a physical thing he could not put down. Owen had asked him something then that Damien had not been prepared for. "Whose silence is it that you're afraid of?" he said. Damien had looked at him. Owen did not clarify. He let the question be a question, and waited. Damien sat with it for a long time. Long enough that in any other context, the silence would have been uncomfortable. Owen Miles was not uncomfortable with silence, which was one of the reasons this worked. "My father's," Damien said eventually. That was the beginning of something in that room. Not an ending, a beginning. The beginning of being honest about a thing he had been carrying since he was a child young enough to still believe that the silence of the man sitting across the dinner table was a message meant for him specifically. His father, Earl Okafor, had been a functional and financially responsible man who had provided for his family with consistency and had offered his children almost nothing in the way of words. Not cruel words, not unkind words, simply no words. He did not say "I love you." He did not say "I'm proud of you." He did not say "I'm sorry" when he was wrong. He communicated in single nods and brief directives, and the particular expressionlessness of a man who had decided, at some point and for some reason, that the interior was not a place he owed anyone access to. Damien had grown up believing this was the correct way to be. He had not believed it consciously. He had simply lived it, the way children live the patterns they absorb, without knowing they have absorbed them. And now he sat across from Owen Miles and said, in the particular way of people who are hearing themselves clearly for the first time, "I think I gave him my silence." Owen had not agreed or disagreed. He had said, "What makes you believe silence is something that can be given?" Damien had not answered that day. He had driven home from the session and sat in the car in the driveway for 11 minutes before going inside. He had sat with the question the way he sat with difficult plays, not pushing at it but letting it show him its angles. He had not reached a conclusion. He came to the nursery floor instead. And this was where he talked. He told Ezra things in the dark that he had never told Renee. Not because he was keeping them from her, but because the dark of the nursery had its own rules about what could be said. and the rules were different in there. He told Ezra about Earl Okafor. He described, for the first time out loud to any listener, what it had felt like to sit across from a man who was your father, and feel the distance between you as a physical room that neither of you crossed. He told Ezra about the afternoon he had run the fastest 40-yard dash of his school career, and had come home, and stood in the kitchen doorway, chest still heaving, to tell his father, and Earl had looked up from the table and said, "Good," and looked back down. Just that. Just good. He told Ezra that good was not enough, that it had never been enough, and he had known it at 15, and had refused to know it for 20 more years, and now he was 34, and sitting on the floor of a nursery, telling his sleeping son the truth about it, because he did not know how to say it anywhere else yet. He told Ezra that he was afraid. He had not said that word, afraid, to anyone, except Renee in the parking lot months ago, when she had asked him directly, and he had told the truth because that was what you did when people you loved asked you directly. But here, in the dark, with no one to see it and no performance required, he said it fully. "I am afraid that you got something from me that I cannot take back. I am afraid that the quiet I carry is inside you, and that it is working against you, and that it is my doing." Ezra slept through it. Damien watched his son's chest rise and fall. He was not sure it mattered whether Ezra heard him. Maybe it mattered more that he was saying it. Maybe the saying of it was the point, not its arrival anywhere, but its departure. At practice the following week, Colin fell into step beside him during the warm-down and said, without preamble, "You seem slightly less like a man sorting through something alone." Damien looked at him sideways. "Slightly," Colin said, making the word approximate. "I'm seeing someone," Damien said. "A therapist." "Good," Colin said. They kept walking. They did not discuss it further, and this was one of the things Damien valued about Colin. The man understood that a conversation could be complete without being long. That evening, Damien came home, and Ezra met him at the door with both arms up, and da, as usual, and Damien picked him up and held him the way he always held him, securely, carefully, with both arms. And he looked at Renee over Ezra's head, and she was looking back at him, and something in the kitchen that had been stiff for weeks was a fraction less stiff tonight. He did not know why exactly. Neither did she. But it was there. Something fractionally changed. He went back to Owen Miles the following Tuesday. He sat in the chair across from that unhurried attention and he said, "You asked me last time whether silence could be given. I've been thinking about it." Owen waited. "I think," Damien said slowly, "I've been confusing silence with damage. My father's silence damaged me in certain ways. But the silence I have, the stillness, that's not the same thing. I chose it. It's not the same as what he had." Owen looked at him. "And your son?" Damien said nothing for a moment. "My son is quiet in his mouth right now," he said finally, "but everything else about him is loud." That sentence stayed with him for a long time. He said it again, alone in the car. He said it again in the nursery that night. And when Ezra shifted in his crib and opened his eyes, and found his father sitting on the floor in the dark, he looked at Damien with those eyes that missed nothing, and he said, just once, softly, like a person placing something carefully, "Da." Like a greeting between old friends who have found each other again after a long time. The office of Dr. Patricia Webb was on the second floor of a specialist children's health center in the east part of the city. It had pale green walls and framed illustrations of animals at child height, and there was a box of building blocks in the corner, and a shelf of worn picture books that had clearly been loved. Dr. Webb herself was a woman in her early 50s, with precise and deliberate speech, and the particular quality of someone who was very direct without being unkind. She had received the referral from Dr. Cole with Ezra's history, and she had reviewed it before they arrived. When they sat down in the chairs across from her desk, she looked at them both, briefly and clearly, and then she looked at Ezra, who was on Renee's lap examining a small plastic animal that Dr. Webb had placed on the desk within his reach. She spoke to Ezra first, not to them about him and his presence, which was something Renee noticed and appreciated. She spoke to Ezra directly, and she watched him respond, or not respond, and how he did not respond, and what he did instead. She gave him 2 instructions, and watched whether he followed them. He did. She held up a picture and named something in it and watched his eyes. They tracked exactly where they should have tracked. She spoke his name and observed the quality of his response. Then she turned to Damien and Renee and asked several questions. The questions were thorough. She asked about family history, about Renee's pregnancy, about Ezra's early development in every area. Damien answered the ones he knew. Renee had her notebook open on her knee and referred to it twice, and Dr. Webb noticed the notebook. "That's helpful," she said. "May I?" She gestured to it. Renee handed it across. Dr. Webb read through several pages. Her face did not change. She handed it back. "Very detailed," she said. "This is genuinely useful." "I noticed patterns," Renee said. "You did," Dr. Webb said. She asked more questions after that. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. Ezra, satisfied with the plastic animal, reached for a second one on the desk, looked at Dr. Webb as if asking permission, and she nodded, and he took it. He began comparing them, one in each hand, with the solemn focus of a child doing important work. To Dr. Webb said, "I want to discuss something with you. It's not a diagnosis, not at this stage. Ezra is young, and I want to be careful about using diagnostic language before a full assessment. But I want to introduce a term so you can look into it before we proceed to the next step. The pattern I'm seeing: strong receptive language, good comprehension, clear intelligence and engagement, alongside the absence of expressive speech, is consistent with something called childhood apraxia of speech." She said the words carefully, not dramatically, the way you might say the name of a road you want someone to be able to find. "It's a motor speech difficulty," she continued. "It means the brain has difficulty coordinating the movements required to produce speech, not because the child doesn't understand language or doesn't want to speak, but because the physical act of producing the sounds requires a level of motor coordination that, in some children, needs to be specifically taught. The comprehension is often entirely normal. The intelligence is entirely normal. It's the output, the pathway between intention and sound, that needs targeted work." She gave them a printed sheet with some information on it. She gave them the names of two highly regarded speech and language therapists in the area who specialized in motor speech difficulties. She wrote down the name of one academic resource she recommended for parents. She told them that early intervention was important and that outcomes with appropriate support were very positive. She said all of this in a clear, steady voice. Damien sat in the chair with his elbows on his knees and asked 4 questions. All 4 were precise. The first was about the assessment process and what it would involve. The second was about the timeline between assessment and diagnosis. The third was about what early intervention looked like in practice. The fourth was about the outcomes data she had seen personally in children who received early and appropriate therapy. She answered all 4. She looked at him while she answered, and she appeared to appreciate the quality of the questions. Renee took notes in her notebook throughout. At the end of the appointment, Dr. Webb shook their hands at the door, and then she crouched down to Ezra's level and held out the plastic animal he had been examining. "You can take this one," she said. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "Da." It was the only word he had, and he used it as a thank you, because in his internal language it functioned as one. Dr. Webb smiled, not a professional smile, something warmer, and stood up and said, "He's communicating constantly. He's not silent at all." That was the last thing she said. They walked to the car in the pale afternoon light. The car park was half empty. Ezra was in Damien's arms, holding his new plastic animal and watching the world go past with his usual interest. Renee walked beside them with her notebook tucked under her arm and her hands in her coat pockets. They drove. They did not speak for the first several minutes, not because there was nothing to say, but because the word apraxia was still in the air between them, finding its shape, and neither of them was ready to start sorting through it yet. This was something they shared, the instinct to let things settle before picking them up. In some circumstances this was a strength. In some, it had cost them. Damien drove. Renee looked out the window at the passing streets. Ezra made small sounds in his car seat, narrating his investigation of the plastic animal in his particular wordless language. They stopped at a red light. Damien reached across and put his hand over Renee's hand, which was resting on her knee. He did not say anything. He just held it. She turned her hand over after a moment and held his back. The light changed. He did not let go immediately. She looked at the road ahead. When they reached home, they put Ezra down for his nap together. They stood on either side of the crib, both watching him for a moment after he settled, and neither of them moved to leave right away. It was one of those moments when the room holds everything, the difficulty and the love of it, all at once, in a single small space. After Ezra was asleep, they sat at the kitchen table. Renee had her laptop open and her notebook beside it. She typed the name into the search bar, childhood apraxia of speech, and they read together. Not silently. Damien leaned toward the screen and read aloud sometimes, the passages that seemed most significant, and Renee made notes. It was the most productive use of silence and speech between them in weeks. What they found was both harder and less hard than they had expected. It was harder because it was real now, with a name and a literature and a range of outcomes that depended entirely on factors that were not yet determined. It was less hard because the literature was full of children who had received early intervention and had caught up and gone on to do everything language is for, telling stories, asking questions, saying the things that need saying. The outcomes, when intervention was early and targeted and consistent, were significantly better than the outcomes without. Renee underlined something on the page 3 times. She said, "Lucy Harmon is on Dr. Webb's list, the therapist we already have." Damien looked. "Yes. She already knows him," Renee said. "He's already comfortable with her." "Yes," he said again. Lucy Harmon had been their speech therapist for 6 weeks at this point. She was, in Renee's estimation, an exceptionally good one. She had a way with Ezra that was partly skill and partly something that could not be taught, a genuine interest in him as a specific and particular person, not a set of deficits to address. She played with him during the sessions. She observed the way he used da, and had been attentive to the notebook Renee brought. She had said at the end of the previous session, with the measured positivity of someone who chooses what she affirms carefully, "He's building something in there. He's working. I can see it." At the next session, 2 days after the appointment with Dr. Webb, Renee told Lucy what Dr. Webb had said. Lucy listened completely. She asked about the specific observations Dr. Webb had made. She asked what the assessment pathway looked like. She looked at Renee, and then at Damien, and she said, "The pattern Dr. Webb described is consistent with what I'm seeing in the sessions. I want to adjust our approach slightly, to target the motor planning elements more directly. That's very treatable. The work looks different, but the outcome we're aiming for doesn't change." Ezra was on the floor of the therapy room during this conversation, arranging a set of colored blocks in what appeared to be a very specific order. Lucy paused in the middle of what she was saying and watched him for a moment. She said, "He knows what he wants to say. He just needs a different road to get it out." Then she looked at Damien. "Bring him to me twice a week from now on. And whatever you're doing at home, keep doing it." She glanced at the notebook in Renee's hands. All of it. She leaned toward the floor and said to Ezra, "Nice work, buddy. That's a very good tower." Ezra looked up at her. He considered the tower. He added one more block to the top. Then he looked at her again. "Da," he said. Lucy smiled at him, warmly and fully. "Da," he said again, with a different inflection this time. "The rising one, the question one." "Yes," she said, as if she understood perfectly. "Good point." Damien watched this exchange from the plastic chair along the wall. He thought, "He is communicating constantly. He's not silent at all." He thought, "He just needs a different road." He sat in the chair and held that thought, and it was both the hardest thing and the thing that felt most like the beginning of something he could actually work with. On the drive home, Ezra fell asleep in his car seat. Renee was quiet beside him. Not the closed quiet of recent months. Something a little more open. She said all of it. "Whatever we're doing at home, keep doing it." Damien nodded. "That includes the nursery floor," Renee said. He looked at her. "I've heard you," she said. "Some of it. I fall half asleep, and I can hear you talking to him." She looked at him carefully. "Keep doing that." He drove. After a moment he said, "I didn't know you could hear." "I know," she said. "But I've heard enough." She paused. "You sound like a good father in there." He held the steering wheel. He did not say anything for a long time. He turned onto their street, past the oak trees, and pulled into the driveway. "Renee," he said. She waited. "I'm trying," he said. "I know it hasn't always looked like it from where you are, but I'm trying." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know you are," she said. "I see it. I just need more of it pointed in my direction sometimes." He nodded. It was the most direct they had been with each other in weeks. Ezra slept in the car seat, entirely unbothered, his rabbit tucked under one arm, peaceful in the way that only the very young and the very tired can achieve. The notebook had begun as a record, a translation guide, of sorts, a document of the variations in a single syllable that a person could use to mean many different things to many people, depending on the direction they pointed it and the music they put inside it. By the 5th month of Da, it was something more than that. It was a map of a child's interior life, drawn in the only lines available. Renee had not set out to make it that. She had simply kept writing, kept noting, kept tracking, not obsessively, not in the anxious circling of someone who cannot let a thing rest, but in the way of a person who finds that making meaning of something is the best way she knows how to be present to it. She had filled half the notebook by November. The early pages were technical in their own informal way. She had categorized the variations, by pitch, by repetition count, by context. She had noted which version of Da Ezra used when he was content, and which he used when he was in need, and the difference was not subtle once you knew to listen for it. She had noted that Da, used in the presence of other adults, people he knew but did not see daily, carried a slightly guarded quality, a caution that was not present in the version he used at home. She had noted that he never used Da to point at himself, which she found interesting, and had mentioned it to Lucy, who had made a note of it as well. But the later pages had started to carry something else, alongside the observations. They carried Renee. Not in a self-indulgent way, not in the way of someone writing for an audience or for posterity, just in the way of a person who discovers, somewhere in the middle of the act of writing, that the pen is doing more than recording. She wrote about the mornings. She wrote about the mirror exercises, the two of them side by side, she making shapes with her mouth, he watching, and sometimes imitating, and sometimes simply watching. She wrote about the specific tenderness of that particular activity, the way Ezra's small face would tighten in concentration when he was trying to do what she was doing, the way he would put his finger to his own lips sometimes, feeling the shape his mouth was making, as if getting to know it for the first time. She wrote about the note, the one she had found in the margin of the notebook's 38th page, in Damien's handwriting, which was small and measured and looked, like everything about him, deliberate. She had not known he had read it. She had left the notebook on the kitchen table before going to bed. She often did. It was part of her evening ritual. And in the morning, it had been exactly where she left it, exactly as she left it, open to the same page. But when she sat down and picked it up and continued writing, she found the note in the margin of the last filled page, written in the narrow ruled space beside her most recent entry, which had described the morning mirror exercise, with a level of detail she had not known she needed to write until she had already written it. 4 words in his handwriting. You learned him, proud. She sat very still for a moment. She read it again. She put the notebook face down on the table. She sat with one hand flat on the back cover and looked out the kitchen window at the garden. The garden was the dormant gray of late November. The bird feeder that Damien had put up in October was empty. She had forgotten to refill it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked the notebook back up and held it in both hands, and read his 4 words again, and this time what she felt was not the sharp thing she had felt the first time, but something steadier and longer, and much harder to name, something that had to do with being seen doing something private and effortful and loving, and having the person see it who you most needed to see it, and having them say so. She told him that evening. Not immediately. Not with ceremony, she told him while she was washing dishes after dinner, with Ezra playing on the floor of the kitchen, and the radio on low, and the ordinary comfortable noise of a Tuesday evening in a house that was doing its best. She said, I found your note. He was at the counter opening the mail, his back to her. In the notebook, she said. He put down the envelope he was holding. He turned around. She was still washing dishes, not looking at him. I meant it, he said. I know you did, she said. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands on the dish towel. She turned to face him. Thank you. He looked at her in that still way of his that she had spent years learning to read. What she read in it now was something she recognized from the early days of knowing him, a warmth that existed behind the quiet, and that the quiet did not diminish, it only contained. I've been reading it since October, he said. She blinked. Since October? A few pages at a time, he said, when you were asleep. She stood in the kitchen holding the dish towel. He said, you write about him the way I talk to him, like he's a full person, like everything he does means something and deserves to be understood. She pressed her lips together. He said, he does. It does. And you saw it before I got there. She looked down for a moment. Then she looked back up at him. You're there now, she said. He nodded. They were quiet for a moment, but it was a different quiet. It had the quality of something that had been stored in separate rooms, being gently moved into the same space. Ezra, on the kitchen floor, looked up from his blocks and found both his parents looking at each other across the room. He looked from one to the other. He said "da" in the low, warm version, the one that meant everything was okay, the one that meant he was here and present, and this was good. It was, perhaps, the most communicative he had ever been with that word. Damien's mother, Claire, came to visit the following weekend. She was a compact, busy, warm woman of 62 who had raised 3 children in a small terraced house in Birmingham and had opinions about most things and kept most of them to herself, which was a balance Damien had inherited in some form. She arrived on the Friday evening with a bag of food she had brought because she did not trust that they were eating properly, which they largely were, and she moved through their house immediately and naturally, the way she had been in it for years. She adored Ezra. She had adored him from the first time she held him, in the hospital, when she had looked at his face and said, he has his grandfather's eyes, which she had said with a mixture of pride and something more complicated that Damien had not known how to interpret. Earl Okafor had died 4 years ago. He had left the world as quietly as he had moved through it, which was, Damien supposed, consistent. Claire spent Saturday morning with Ezra, while Renee went to see a friend she hadn't seen since before maternity leave. Damien was at a short Saturday session at the club. When he came home at noon, he found his mother and his son on the living room floor. Claire had brought a set of wooden stacking rings, an old set that had belonged to Damien himself. They were the kind that had been made when toys were made simply, without electronics or noise, just bright rings, and a post, and the logical satisfaction of sorting them. Ezra was stacking them in the wrong order on purpose, which was his way of establishing that he had understood the rules and chosen to deviate from them, and Claire was playing along perfectly. That evening, after Ezra was in bed and Renee was on the phone upstairs, Claire sat with Damien at the kitchen table. She drank her tea. She asked about the club, about the season, about Dennis Holt, whom she had met twice and found formidable. She asked about how Renee was holding up. Then she said, you know he'll get there, Ezra. Damien looked at her. He's going to surprise everyone, she said. She said it with a certainty that was specific, not the vague encouragement of someone trying to be kind. He asked, what makes you say it like that? She wrapped both hands around her mug. She looked at the table. She said, because you did. He waited. She looked up. You didn't speak clearly until after your 2nd birthday, she said. Not a single word anyone could properly understand. You understood everything we said to you. You were quick as anything, watching everything, following us around, but nothing came out. She paused. Your father said you were fine. He said late talkers were nothing to worry about, which was partly true and partly, she paused again, choosing the words carefully, partly how he handled anything that required him to sit with something uncomfortable. Damien was very still. We took you to a specialist eventually, she said. When you were 2.5, they gave us exercises. Your father didn't come to those appointments. She said that without bitterness, just with the particular flatness of facts that have been lived and processed and set down long ago. You caught up. By 3 you were talking in full sentences. Damien sat with this for a long time. He had no memory of any of it. He had built his earliest memories of himself around the composed, certain, quietly communicative person he had been, from as far back as he could recall. He had believed, somewhere deep and unchecked, that he had always been that way, that the stillness and the measured speech were original features, not developed ones. Why didn't you ever tell me, he said. She looked at him. You never needed to know, she said. Until now. He looked at the table. She reached across and put her hand over his for a moment, brief and warm, the same gesture he had made to Renee at the red light outside Dr. Webb's office, and then she picked up her mug again. He got it from both sides, she said. The patience. The watching before the speaking. It's not a broken thing. It's a particular thing. After his mother went to bed, Damien sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet around him. He sat without moving, not from composure this time, but from the particular stillness of a person who has received something large and needs to let it settle. He thought about Earl Okafor. He thought about his own 2-year-old silence, which he could not remember. He thought about the specialist and the exercises that his father had not attended, and the weight of that, not with anger, which would have been easier, but with something more complicated, the grief of understanding someone you have already lost, and being too late to say it to their face. He thought about sitting on the nursery floor, telling Ezra about a man who said good instead of, "I'm proud of you." He thought about the question Owen Miles had asked, "What did your silence protect you from?" He thought he was beginning to know the answer. He went to the nursery. He sat on the floor. He did not speak for a long time. He just sat, and Ezra slept in his crib 3 feet away, breathing in that steady, reliable rhythm, entirely at peace with the quiet. Damien looked at his son's face in the dark. He was not afraid of the silence between them. For the first time in a very long time, he was not afraid of it at all. The morning of the Tuesday in March began like most mornings began in that house, earlier than anyone preferred, with the particular gray light of late winter pressing through the curtains, and the sound of Ezra stirring in his crib somewhere between 6 and 6:15. Damien was leaving for practice at 7. He had a full training session followed by a review meeting with the coaching staff, and Dennis Holt had made it clear the evening before that the review meeting was not the kind you left early. He was dressed and in the kitchen by 6:40, drinking his coffee, standing up at the counter the way he always did, and Renee came downstairs with Ezra on her hip at 6:47, and Ezra saw Damien and said, "Duh," with the full-body brightness of someone greeting the day's best news. Damien put his coffee down and took Ezra and held him for a moment, the way he did every morning, the way he had done every morning since the boy was old enough to be held like a person rather than a parcel. He pressed his lips to Ezra's forehead. He handed him back to Renee. He picked up his coffee. "What time will you be back?" Renee asked. 4, maybe half 4, he said. "The review goes as long as it goes." She nodded. She had Ezra on her hip and was opening the fridge one-handed, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for 22 months. Ezra was watching the contents of the fridge with great interest, which was his position on most things in the world, of great interest. Damien kissed Renee on the cheek. He said goodbye to Ezra, who was now focused entirely on whether a yogurt was going to be produced, and then he picked up his bag and his keys and went out the front door into the late winter air. The sky was an overcast pale, the kind of sky that holds everything muted, not raining, not quite cold enough to need a second layer, just the gray in-between of a March morning that hasn't decided what it wants to be. He backed the car out of the drive and drove through streets that were already building toward the morning's traffic, quiet in the stretches between the lights, louder at the junctions. He had done this drive many times. He knew every landmark between their house and the training complex, and his mind was on the session ahead and not on the house behind, the way it always was by the time he reached the end of the street. Renee, inside, put Ezra in his high chair and gave him the yogurt, which turned out to be what he was after, confirmed by the small sound of satisfaction he made when it was placed in front of him. And then she stood at the counter and drank her tea and looked out the kitchen window at the garden. She was tired this morning, not in any particular way, just in the continuous, background way of someone who has been managing a lot for a long time and has not had a proper night of deep sleep in weeks. She had been up at 2 with Ezra, who had woken from something she could not identify, not a nightmare, not pain, just the inexplicable wakefulness of toddlers, and had spent 40 minutes settling him before he went back down. She felt the tiredness in her shoulders and behind her eyes, and she thought about the laundry on the drying rack that needed folding, and the grocery delivery that was coming at noon and would need to be put away, and the appointment with Lucy Harmon on Thursday that she needed to confirm, and the form she had not yet completed for the developmental assessment that Dr. Webb had requested. She finished her tea. She took Ezra out of the high chair and wiped his hands and his face and the tray of the chair and the corner of the table nearest to him, which had somehow also received yogurt in the course of this event. She gave him his rabbit, which he had been reaching for since he finished eating. She put him on the living room floor with the basket of toys and the board books, including his current favorite, a thick, padded book with an animal on every page, bought second-hand from a charity shop, and therefore worn at the edges, in the soft way of things that have been well used. She went back to the kitchen. She washed the breakfast things, she folded the laundry from the rack, standing at the kitchen table, and working through the pile, with the half-automatic efficiency of someone who has done this often enough that the body does it without requiring the mind to be present. She thought about Thursday's session with Lucy. She thought about what Lucy had said at the last session, which was that Ezra was making progress in the motor planning work, even though the verbal output had not yet changed significantly. Lucy had said, "The internal work happens first. When the external work comes, it comes with a foundation." Renee had written that down. She heard Ezra in the living room, moving around, making the small sounds of concentrated toddler activity. She did not go in. She could hear him. He was fine. The radio was off. She had not turned it on today, which she sometimes did and sometimes did not, depending on whether she wanted company or quiet. And today she had found herself wanting the quiet, without quite knowing why. The kitchen was very still. She finished the laundry. She moved the folded stack to the bottom of the stairs to go up later. She came back and wiped down the counter. She stood at the sink for a moment and looked out the window at the garden. A bird was on the fence. A small, brown, unremarkable bird, and it sat for a moment and then left. From the living room, she heard a particular kind of quiet. Not an alarming quiet. Not the suddenly absent quiet that makes a parent move fast. Just the settled, absorbed quiet of a child who has found something he is very interested in. She knew the difference between Ezra's quiets. This was the good one, the one that meant he had pulled something into his full attention and was inside it completely. She stayed in the kitchen. She put on the kettle. She stood at the counter, while the kettle worked, and looked at nothing in particular, thinking about the grocery delivery, and the form for Dr. Webb, and the fact that the bird feeder needed refilling again. And then she heard something. It was quiet. It was brief. It came from the living room. She stopped. She stood completely still at the counter, with the kettle just coming to a boil behind her. She waited. The living room was quiet again. She thought, I imagined it. She thought, the kettle is loud. She thought, maybe it was the television on the other side of the shared wall. And then it came again. She moved very slowly, the way you move toward something when you are afraid that any quick motion might change it. She moved to the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and stood there with her hand on the frame. Ezra was on the floor. He had the board book in both hands. He had turned to the cover, which had an image on it, a bear, large and soft-colored, sitting beside a smaller bear, her cub, in a setting of gentle trees. He was looking at the cover. He had been looking at it, apparently, for some time. He looked up. He looked directly at Renee in the doorway. He held up the book, and he said it. He said it in a voice that was small and clear and entirely deliberate, with the particular precision of someone who has been carrying a word inside them for a long time, and has finally found the right moment to put it down where it belongs. He said, "Mama?" Renee did not move. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and she was not certain, for one long, suspended moment that felt like falling slowly, whether she had heard what she had heard, or whether the wanting of it had been large enough to create the sound of it. She waited. Ezra held the book up a fraction higher. He looked at her with his wide, patient eyes. He said it again. "Mama." Renee's hand slid off the doorframe. She walked into the living room. She sat down on the floor, right where she was, in the doorway almost, with her back against the wall and her legs folded in front of her. She sat down, the way you sit down when you have been standing for a long time and your knees have simply decided to stop. She looked at him. "Yes, baby," she said. Her voice came out quiet, the way she meant it. "That's right. That's Mama." Ezra looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the book. He turned a page. He found the page with the giraffe. He considered it with apparent satisfaction. Renee sat on the floor. She had a sock in her right hand. She did not know how it had gotten there. She had been folding laundry earlier. It must have come with her somehow. She sat on the floor of the living room, with a sock in one hand, and her son across from her, reading his book, and she did not move. She did not cry. Not yet. Not right away. She just sat in the moment, the way you sit, in something rare, something that exists in exact balance, and might tip over if you breathe wrong. She sat there for she was not sure how long. Then she reached into her pocket with the hand that was not holding the sock. She found her phone. She sat for one more minute. She sat there because there are moments that belong entirely to one person, and this was one of them, and she wanted to be in it alone for just a little longer, before it became the story she would tell for the rest of her life. Then she called Damien. The training pitch on a Tuesday morning in March had a particular smell that Damien had known for years: cut grass and morning damp, and the particular athletic smell of exertion beginning, that specific blend of work and cold air that existed on practice fields the same way everywhere. He was running passing drills with Luke Ashby when his phone buzzed in the jacket he had left on the bench at the sideline. He could not feel it from the field, but the phone rang twice, and a second-year assistant who was managing equipment near the bench heard it and made no move to answer it, because that was not his job, and because everyone in that organization knew better than to touch Damien Okafor's personal belongings. It rang again 15 minutes later, during a water break. Damien saw the name on the screen. He stepped away from the group. He walked 6 feet to the left, which in his language meant, "This is private," which everyone who knew him understood to mean stay away. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Renee," he said. She said his name. He heard it in her voice immediately. He could not have described to anyone else what exactly he heard, because it was something that required years of close attention to a specific person to decode. It was not distress, it was not fear, it was something else, something that had edges that were different from those two things, something that was inside a register he had rarely heard her use. He said, "What happened?" She said, "He said a word." Damien was very still. "A second word," she said. "Damien, he said a second word." He did not respond immediately. She said, "He said mama." The practice field was 50 yards of activity around him. Luke Ashby was throwing to Darian Foale near the end zone. Calvin Duke was arguing cheerfully with a coach about something related to the snap count. Dennis Holt was watching the linebackers from the opposite end of the field, hands in his vest pockets, head slightly bowed in the way he had when he was studying something closely. Damien sat down. He sat down on the bench without deciding to, the way you sit when the decision to stand has been made by something external to your legs. He sat on the sideline bench with his elbows on his knees and his phone held to his ear, and he looked at the ground in front of his feet, and he breathed. He said, "Say it again." He meant her. He wanted to hear her say it again. She said, "He said mama, Damien." He held up his book, and he looked at me, and he said mama. The coordinator, Paul Groves, had been walking past. He saw Damien's face. He stopped. He looked at Damien the way a person looks when they cannot tell what is wrong, but can tell that something large is happening. He started to say something. Damien held up one hand. Paul stopped. The sound that came out of Damien Okafor was not a word. It was not something he chose or controlled or even fully understood until it had already left him. It was something older than language, something that exists underneath words, in the place words are meant to reach but rarely do. He pressed his free hand over his eyes. He sat on the bench on the training ground in March and he let it happen. Paul Groves put a hand on his back and then took it away and walked quietly back toward the cluster of coaches at the far end of the field. He said something brief to Dennis. Dennis looked across the pitch at Damien and said nothing and looked back at the linebackers. On the phone, Renee was saying his name. "I'm here," he said. "Are you okay?" she said. "Yes," he said, and he meant it entirely. He told Paul Groves he needed to leave early. Paul said, "Of course, go," and did not ask for an explanation, and Damien understood that Paul had already understood enough from what he had seen on the bench. He drove home. The drive took 22 minutes. He drove the way he always drove, steadily, without rushing, hands at 10 and 2, and he did not play the radio, and he did not think about the review meeting, or the session he was leaving early, or any of the 17 other things that lived in the practical structure of his days. He thought about Renee sitting on the living room floor with a sock in her hand. He thought about Ezra holding up a book with a mother bear and a cub on the cover. He thought, he knew. He was waiting for the right moment, and he chose the right Tuesday. He pulled into the driveway. Renee met him at the door. Ezra was napping. She had put him down 20 minutes ago, his usual early afternoon sleep. She was standing in the hallway when Damien came through the door, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He stepped forward and held her properly, not carefully, the way he had held her when she was pregnant, but properly, with both arms, and his full strength, the way he held things he was no longer afraid of losing. She held him back. They stood in the hallway. After a while she said, into his shoulder, "I just sat there. For a while. I couldn't move." "I know," he said. "I didn't cry right away," she said. "I know that too." She pulled back to look at him. "You, on the other hand," she said. He said nothing. He was not going to deny it. They went to the kitchen. She made tea. Not for any particular reason, just because having something to do with her hands helped her settle into a moment. He sat at the table. She brought 2 mugs and sat across from him, and she put her notebook on the table between them without opening it. He looked at the notebook. "I've already written it," she said. "The whole thing. How it happened. What he was doing. What I was doing." She touched the cover. "I wrote it before I called you. I needed to write it before I called anyone." He understood that. It was very like her. He said, "What does it say?" She opened the notebook to the page. She read it to him, not performing it, just reading it plainly, the way she had written it, plain and honest and a little breathless in places, because she had been plain and honest and a little breathless when she wrote it. He listened. When she finished, he closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them, and he looked at her, and he said, "Read me the last line again." She read, "I didn't cry right away. I just sat very still, because I didn't want the air to move. I said, 'Yes, baby, that's right.' And he went back to his book. And I sat there on the floor, with one sock in my hand, for I don't know how long." He nodded. They were quiet. He reached across the table and put his hand flat on the notebook, beside her hand. He did not speak. He did not need to. That evening, after Ezra woke from his nap, they all had dinner together at the kitchen table. Ezra ate pasta with his fingers, because he had decided that this was more effective than the spoon, and nobody objected to this because tonight, of all nights, pasta fingers seemed fine. Damien was talking more than usual, not more than the room could hold, not in a way that felt unlike him, but with an openness that had not been as present recently. He told Renee about the drive home. He told her what the training pitch had smelled like this morning. He told her that Paul Groves had put a hand on his back, and that he had not expected that from Paul, and that it had been the right thing. She listened. After dinner, Damien was on the floor of the living room with Ezra, rolling a soft ball back and forth between them, which was Ezra's current favorite game. Renee stood in the kitchen doorway watching. Damien held up the board book, the one with the bear and the cub. He pointed to the mother bear. He said, "Who's this?" Ezra looked at the picture. He looked at Damien. He turned his head. He looked past Damien, across the living room, to the kitchen doorway where Renee was standing. He pointed at her. He said, "Mama." Renee pressed her hand over her mouth. Damien did not look back at her. He looked at his son, and he nodded, slowly, twice, the nod of a man receiving something important. He said, quietly and just to Ezra, "That's right, pup, that's exactly right." That night, after Ezra was down, Renee sat at the kitchen table. She opened the notebook. She turned to the next clean page. She picked up her blue pen. She wrote, "He knew." He was always going to say it. He was just waiting for the right Tuesday. She closed the notebook. She sat in the kitchen that was quiet and warm, and hers, and she let the day be what it had been, and she did not try to contain it or make sense of it or hold it still. She just let it be. The second word changed things. Not immediately, and not dramatically, and not in the way that stories sometimes describe change, as a sudden clearing, a before and after with a bright line between them. Real change is rarely like that. Real change happens the way the light changes in a room when the season turns outside the window, gradually, consistently, until one day you look around and realize the quality of everything is different, and you cannot identify the exact moment it shifted. The weeks after the Tuesday in March had that quality. Words came, slowly, each one its own small ceremony, each one received in the household with a particular attention, that was like the attention people give to rare and welcome things. They did not make a performance of it. They had been careful, with Lucy Harmon's guidance, Not to over-celebrate each word in a way that put pressure on the next one. Not to make speech feel like a performance with an audience waiting. But between the three of them, in the ordinary moments of ordinary days, each new word carried its own quiet weight. No arrived on a Saturday morning in April, directed at a bowl of porridge that Ezra had decided he was not interested in. He looked at the bowl, looked at Renee, and said, "No," with a clarity and a calm that suggested he had given this some thought. Renee had to turn away to hide the smile. She brought him toast instead. More came at Lucy Harmon's Thursday session. Ezra had been playing with a set of stacking cups that he liked very much, and Lucy had removed them as part of an exercise to encourage him to request things verbally, and after a moment of looking at the empty space where the cups had been, Ezra had looked at Lucy and said, "More." Just that. One word. Clear, correctly applied, perfectly timed. Lucy had said yes, and given him the cups immediately, and written something in her notes with a speed that suggested it was the something she had been waiting to write. Damien had been there that day. He sat in the chair along the wall, and he watched his son say a second word in 8 days, and he put one fist against his mouth, and pressed it there for a moment, and said nothing. The da did not disappear. This was something they had wondered, whether new words would crowd it out, or replace it. But Ezra seemed to understand that he had more capacity now, more vessels, and da remained the most versatile, and the most frequently used, even as new words joined it. He used da for Damien, and he used it for emphasis, and he used it at the end of certain requests as if for punctuation, and the family had been fluent in it long enough that this continued to work. At home, the change that had begun in the weeks before the Tuesday continued and deepened. Damien talked more. Not in a way that felt unlike him. He was still the man of measured speech, still the person who chose his words with care and did not fill silence for the sake of filling it. But the choosing was more generous. He spoke more at dinner. He asked questions that had a real answer rather than questions that opened a conversation, and then let Renee do all the work of keeping it open. He told her things in the evenings, small things, things about practice, things about conversations he had had with Colin or with Paul Groves, things about what he was thinking, in the manner of someone who has discovered that speaking the interior is not a loss. He had talked about it with Owen Miles. He had said, in the session the week after the Tuesday, that he thought Ezra had taught him something he had been trying to learn for most of his adult life, which was that being understood was possible, that the vocabulary existed if you were willing to find it. Owen had said, and Ezra found his. Damien had looked at him. "He's still finding it," he said. Owen nodded. "But he never stopped trying," Damien said. "Even when the only word he had was one syllable, he used it for everything it could hold." He sat with that. Then he said, "I had more than one syllable. I had plenty of syllables. I just decided the reach wasn't worth it." Owen was quiet. "It is," Damien said. He was not announcing a resolution. He was stating something he had arrived at, the way you arrive at an address you have been navigating toward for a long time. At practice, his coordinator Paul Groves noticed the change. Not in Damien's performance, which had always been the same, consistent, intelligent, composed, but in the team meetings. Damien had always answered when called on. Now he spoke without being called on. He offered observations in the film room that he might previously have held back. He asked questions in strategy discussions that opened the conversation to angles others had not considered. Dennis Holt said nothing about it. He simply noticed it, and his noticing had a warmth in it that was visible to anyone who knew how to read the man. Colin Marsh, who knew exactly how to read Dennis Holt, found Damien after a practice in April, and fell into step beside him and said, "Holt looked at you like a proud father 3 times in the film room today." "I counted 2, Damien said. 3, Colin said. "You missed one when you were looking at the screen." They walked together toward the car park. Colin said, without making it a big thing, "Good, by the way. Whatever changed?" Damien said, "A lot of things." "Yeah," Colin said, "but you look like a man who put something down that he'd been carrying for a while." Damien thought about this as he drove home. He thought it was not quite right. He had not put anything down. He had discovered that some of what he had been carrying was not the weight he had believed it was. Some of it was just his particular way of being in the world, which was not broken and had never been broken, only misunderstood by himself for a long time. There was an evening in May when Renee's sister Pamela came for the weekend, and it was different from other visits. Pam had done something in the month since October. She had, unprompted and without being asked, read about childhood apraxia of speech. She had read 2 books and several articles. She had done it, she told Renee on the phone before the visit, because she wanted to understand, not because she thought she needed to, but because understanding felt like the only useful thing she could offer, and she wanted to be useful. She was different with Ezra. She crouched to his level. She spoke to him directly and clearly, and waited for his response, whatever form it took, with the patience of someone who had been told that the response would come in its own form, and on its own terms. When Ezra said "da" to her, the bright, short version, the one that meant something good, she looked at Renee with wide eyes, and Renee said, "He likes you." And Pam looked genuinely pleased, in a way that was nothing like the cheerful dismissiveness of before. After Ezra was in bed on the Saturday night, the 3 of them, Renee, Pam, and Damien, sat in the kitchen over tea. The conversation was not about Ezra's speech. It moved across many things. Pam's work, a film they had all watched recently, the state of the kitchen tap that had been dripping for 2 months. But under all of it was a warmth and an ease that had not been present in previous visits, and Renee, in the middle of something Damien was saying about the dripping tap, felt something ease inside her that had been tight for a long time. The community event happened in June. It had come through a speech and language charity that Lucy Harmon was connected to, an organization that supported families navigating communication difficulties in young children. They ran an annual evening event, mostly a gathering of families and some light fundraising, and Lucy had mentioned it to Renee and suggested that Damien might be willing to speak briefly if he was comfortable. She had said it carefully, not assuming, giving him room to decline. She had said that sometimes having someone well known at these events made other families feel less alone. Damien had said he would do it. He had been more nervous about it than he expected to be. He prepared in the way he prepared for things that mattered, carefully, completely, but without scripts, because he had never been someone who could say a scripted thing and have it sound real. He knew what he wanted to say. He just needed to find the way to say it. The event was held in a community hall in the city, a large room with round tables and families at most of them. There were children everywhere, of various ages and various configurations of communication difficulty, and the noise was both ordinary and specific, the noise of people who have been in difficult places and have chosen to be in the same room together. Damien stood up when it was his turn. He looked at the room. He said, "My son is 22 months old. He has one clear word that he has been using for 7 months. It's da. He uses it for almost everything. For his rabbit, which is his most important possession. For requests and questions and observations. For me." He paused. His mother had a longer wait. "She is the one who is going to hear the second word first, and I want to tell you what that has been like. Not for her, she can tell her own story, but for me. Watching someone who loves your child more quietly and more persistently than they will ever be given credit for." The room was quiet. He said, "I've been afraid this whole time that my son's silence came from me. I'm a quiet person. My father was a quiet person. I thought I passed something broken down the line." He stood still at the front of the room, and the particular quality of his stillness was its own presence, the same way it was always its own presence. "I didn't. What I passed down was the patience to communicate in whatever way is available. The willingness to be understood, even when the only tool you have is one syllable." He looked out at the tables. "My son is not silent. He has never been silent. He has been saying everything that could be said with one word, with a precision that would embarrass most adults. I am learning from him. I should have started learning from him earlier." He sat down. The room held its quiet for a moment. Then it applauded. Renee was in the front row. She put her hands together and kept them together for a long time, and looked at her husband and thought about a parking lot in November and a kitchen in March, and a blue notebook, and a note in a margin that had 4 words in it. After the event, a man came up to Damien at the edge of the room. He was holding a small child, a girl of perhaps 18 months, with bright eyes and a grip on her father's collar. The man looked like he had not slept well in several weeks. He said, "My daughter only has one word too." Damien looked at the girl. The girl looked at Damien with the frank and total attention of a very young child who has not yet learned to pretend to look at something else. Damien said, "What's the word?" The man said, "Mama. Just mama. Over and over. For everything." Damien looked at the man. He said, "She's already talking to you. You just have to learn the language." The man stood very still for a moment. He looked down at his daughter. He nodded. Once, slowly. Damien nodded back. Ezra turned 2 in late March. 3 weeks later, he said his 5th word, which was up, applied with great efficiency to any situation in which he wished to be elevated. He said his 6th and 7th words in the same week in April. Ball, and no more, which Lucy Harmon counted as 1 word, and Renee counted as 2, and Damien declined to adjudicate. By the summer he had 14 distinct words, some clearer than others, all of them intentional. Lucy had revised her trajectory estimate upward twice. Claire came back in July, for Ezra's unofficial half-birthday, which was not a real occasion, but which Claire had decided warranted a visit and a cake. She made the cake from scratch in Renee and Damien's kitchen, and Ezra stood at the kitchen counter and watched the whole process with the devotion of a person who has identified the most important activity in the room and positioned himself accordingly. When the cake came out and cooled and was placed on the table, and Claire cut the first slice and put it on a small plate and handed it to Ezra, he took the plate in both hands. He walked, very carefully, across the kitchen floor to where Damien was sitting. He held up the plate. He said, "Duh." He paused. He said, "Eat." 2 words, back to back, a sentence, imperfect and complete. Damien took the plate. He looked at his son. He said, "2 words. You used 2 words." Ezra looked at him for a moment with those eyes that missed nothing. Then he turned and walked back to the counter to investigate what else was available. Renee, standing in the kitchen doorway with her hand pressed over her heart, met Damien's eyes across the room. Claire, at the counter with her tea towel over her shoulder, was making the particular sound of a woman who is trying not to cry and considers it beneath her dignity to succeed in this effort. The summer moved on. The words kept coming. Slowly, one at a time, each one earned, each one a small door opening in a wall that had seemed very solid for a very long time. By September, Ezra had 22 words. Lucy said she had stopped counting and started listening instead, which was, she explained, how she knew he was on his way. On a Sunday evening in September, the family of 3 was on the back porch, the kind of evening that September offers sometimes, when the summer is still close enough to be generous, but the autumn is already in the air, changing the quality of the light into something golden and slightly elegiac. Ezra was sitting on the step between Damien and Renee, his rabbit beside him, a piece of dry grass in his hand that he had been examining for several minutes. None of them were talking. The quiet was not the old quiet. It was not the quiet of things held separately. It was the quiet of 3 people who have been through something together and have arrived, still together, on the other side of it, and have discovered that the other side has its own particular sweetness. Ezra looked up. He looked at the sky, which was full of the orange and rose of a September evening setting into night. He pointed at it. He looked at Damien. He said, "Pretty." Quietly, clearly. 1 word, perfectly chosen, perfectly placed. His 9th new word. Damien and Renee both heard it. Neither of them moved. They did not speak. They did not reach for each other, or for him, or for the phones in their pockets. They did not try to capture it or confirm it, or make it into anything larger than what it was. They let it be. They let the word hang in the September air above the back porch, over the garden, where the bird feeder was full now, and the oak tree on the property line was beginning its slow turn toward color. They let their son have his moment in the fading light, and in the way that only parents who have waited for something for a very long time truly understand. They knew that the waiting had not been empty. The waiting had been full, all the way through. Full of the blue notebook and the nursery floor and the parking lot in November and the kitchen in March and the boy who had taken the most important word he knew and held it until he found the right Tuesday to put it somewhere it belonged. The pup had always been speaking. They had simply been learning his language, and the language, it turned out, was worth every long and patient month it had taken to learn.